One of the abiding themes of art history is that every generation views the previous generation's art with a highly critical eye and a determination to produce something new and better. So, the classical Greek sculptors thought the archaic sculptors were too stiff, and just check out those goofy smiles. The Hellenistic Greek sculptors thought the classical sculptors were cold, emotionless purists, while the classical Roman sculptors thought the Hellenistic Greeks lacked dignity. The Renaissance artists called their predecessors Gothic or barbarian, but let's face it, Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, Titian, these superstars are hard acts to follow, especially on their home turf, Italy. Nevertheless, the next generation rather bravely decided to rebel. So I'm kicking off this unit on Baroque art with the immediate eras of the Italian High Renaissance, a period that art historians have somewhat confusingly labeled Mannerism. It's kind of a way station between Renaissance and Baroque art. So let's begin by considering the work of an artist who outlived most of his own generation and traveled the road from High Renaissance to Mannerism in his own painting. The Last Judgment is a very prominent element in the Sistine Chapel, which is a required work, but it is not one of the required images within the chapel. Whether it's on the test or not, you should know this very important painting. On this slide, we see two fresco paintings by Michelangelo, both from the Sistine Chapel, but painted 30 years apart. Of course, the subject matter is different, and the Last Judgment is inherently a rather grim subject. Still, what changes do you observe? In the earlier painting, God the Father appears powerful, yes, but not really forbidding. In the Last Judgment, God the Son is a genuinely scary figure. Even by Michelangelo's standards, Christ's body is almost grotesquely muscled, powerful to the point, I think, of seeming dangerous and threatening, especially since he's gazing down not at the saved, but at the damned. Even his mother Mary, pictured behind him, seems to be cowering a little in Christ's presence, unlike Eve in the earlier painting, who looks eager if a little shy as she rests under God's sheltering arm. So it's really hard to see this huge and complex painting on a single slide, but I wanted to give you a quick look at the entire composition. Note that we're seeing, in some ways, a return to the complex and crowded compositional style we saw in Michelangelo's first ceiling fresco, the panel, The Flood, on the right, a style he largely rejected for the rest of the Sistine Chapel ceiling. And here, by way of contrast, is Raphael's School of Athens, perhaps the epitome of High Renaissance composition. So, what comparisons strike you? The Last Judgment is busier, even frenetically busy. The figures are twisted, moving, dramatic. The effect of the School of Athens, on the other hand, is soothing and rational. Michelangelo's painting is intended to unsettle the viewer and presumably to turn our thoughts towards sin and its consequences. It's a much, much less confident and self-congratulatory painting, and as such, it reflects the spirit of the age, as I'll explain. But first, let me note that one reason we find this painting unsettling is its choice of colors. We haven't talked about color in much detail since our very first unit, but let's take another look at the color wheel and pay special attention to what are labeled as tertiary colors. These are not colors we readily expect to see, and painters often use them to jar our senses, to startle us and catch us off guard. So it's a little hard to pick out, but Michelangelo has moved toward a greater use of tertiary colors in The Last Judgment. This is characteristic of Manner's paintings. We find these colors, again, somewhat disturbing, and again, that effect is entirely deliberate. So here we see a detail of the damned. Note the writhing, distorted figures, the sense of movement, the high drama and emotion. We are moving into the Mannerist period and even the Baroque. But by the Baroque era, as we'll soon see, the church and its artists have regained their confidence. The paintings are dramatic, definitely, but less unsettling. Stay tuned. So here is a detail again of The Last Judgment. St. Bartholomew, who was martyred by having his skin flayed. Michelangelo has given the skinned saint his own face. You see a contemporary portrait of Michelangelo on the right. And you remember that he also gave Holofernes his face on the Sistine Chapel. So what might be inspiring this grim introspection? Well, by the time Michelangelo was painting The Last Judgment, life in Italy and Europe was getting pretty grim. The wars over whether Europe would be Protestant or Catholic were entangled with wars between two Catholic monarchs, Francis I of France and Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. And they were fighting over which of them would rule the continent of Europe. Italy mostly just got ground up in the process. In 1527, Protestant German soldiers fighting for the Catholic Holy Roman Empire mutinied since they hadn't been paid. They marched on Rome and they spent several days killing, raping, and setting everything in their path on fire. We also know from Michelangelo's letters and poems that he was deeply troubled by the turmoil in the church. He seems, for example, to have had some sympathy with Luther's criticisms of indulgences. As he grew older, Michelangelo was also plagued by a sense of sinfulness and doubts about his own salvation. And finally, Michelangelo was once again struggling with the papal patron. The Catholic Church was finally taking Luther's call for reform seriously. The new non-Medici Pope, Paul III, set out to end many of the abuses that had helped spark the Protestant Reformation. This was the Pope who convened the Council of Trent, which you read about in your homework. One of Pope Paul III's reform efforts brought him into conflict with this now elderly Michelangelo. And this is just too good a story to skip, so I want you to watch a short clip about this, the only one today, I promise. The term Mannerism is actually a 20th century invention, and you'll probably, as you'll discover in the spring, 20th century artists and art historians love to come up with isms. So, we've had a glimpse of Mannerist style and an introduction to one element in its cultural context, the wars of religion and the Catholic Counter-Reformation. Another contextual element of Mannerism, remember how tests tend to ask contextual questions. Another contextual element was the court patronage of Italian princely courts, including the Medici, who were now raised to the status of nobility and back in power in Florence. But these were not the old quasi-republican Medicis. These Medicis were Grand Dukes, and their world was a world where elegant style was often seen as more important than the rationalism that Cosimo de' Medici had so admired, and elegant artifice was honored above naturalism. This painting is not a required work, but it's a famous example of Mannerism, and I could imagine showing it up on the test to be identified as Mannerist. So you read about Mannerism in your textbook. What Mannerist elements do you observe in this painting? The Renaissance strove for a kind of realism, getting the bodies right, getting the proportions right, announcing the artist's interest in human beings and life here on earth by getting away from what they perceived as Gothic distortions. Well, distortions reappear in Michelangelo's Last Judgment and in these courtly paintings as well. The hands and feet are often out of proportion. They look almost boneless. Mannerists were actually obsessed with hands, beautiful, useless hands that were a sign of aristocratic status, a little like the bound feet of Chinese women. The faces are often hiding their emotions from the world. Mannerist artists were obsessed with masks, and an aristocratic culture where people deliberately masked their emotions and intentions. The whole painting has a rather chilly emotionless quality, typical of courtly Mannerism. We're going to get to our required work, I promise. But first, I want to talk only briefly about the painter whom I think is by far the most interesting and important Mannerist, but who has disappeared from the list. El Greco just means the Greek. I put his real name up on the slide, but he's always referred to as El Greco. He was born on the island of Crete and trained as an icon painter. But El Greco also spent some time studying in Venice and taking in the works of Titian and his followers. But El Greco spent most of his working life, his last 37 years, living in Spain, where he soaked up Spain's fervent spiritualism. St. Teresa of Avila, whom we'll soon meet, was a Spanish saint. He also captured its bright but stark light. So this is probably El Greco's most famous painting. Used to show up on the AP Art History exam all the time, but it's no longer on the list. So I won't linger, except to note that El Greco divided his universe into a lower earthly sphere and a higher heavenly sphere. Earth is realistically portrayed and indeed reveals El Greco's Renaissance Venetian training in the use of light and color. Of course, it also shows some Mannerist conventions, such as pale, elongated aristocratic faces. But the heavenly spheres explode into contorted shapes, jarring tertiary colors, and a whirling movement that contrasts strongly with the solemn, still figures below. Okay, this one's really in here because it's one of my favorite paintings, but I think with a stretch it could be called a Mannerist landscape. And here's one more that I stuck in. Check out El Greco's rendition of one of our favorite Hellenistic scenes. Okay, our required Mannerist work, finally. So, why the double title? Well, it turns out we don't really know if the painting depicts an entombment or a deposition because we don't see a cross or a tomb or any other useful spatial or landscape clues. That's a deliberate choice by the artist. Renaissance painters made much more effort to produce realistic settings. This descent, or is it a deposition or entombment, seems to take place in a kind of artificial space. So what other Mannerist elements do you see in Pintormo's painting? Well, the bodies seem weightless. Who is supporting Christ, and why isn't he heavy? The positioning of the legs seems staged and unrealistic. While much more emotional than the Madonna we just saw, the emotion still seems almost posed, contrived, theatrical rather than real. Back to those masks again. And of course, those colors are startling, paler, more orange than red. In a few minutes, you're going to be comparing this to other earlier and later depictions of the same biblical scene. But first, I wanted to flash a couple more Mannerist works at you just to help you recognize the style if you get hit with an attribution question. You saw this on the Khan Academy video, I hope. It's a fresco in the same chapel where the deposition entombment hangs. Note the elongated figures and the twisted bodies. And some more attribution practice. Any guess who designed and built the chapel that houses both of these works? Did you guess Brunelleschi? If so, you were right. Branzino was an apprentice of Pintormo. Note how he portrays skin almost as if it were a porcelain mask. In part, this reflects the aristocratic audience for Mannerist works. People who did not need to labor in the sun were pale. And this is an even more famous work by Branzino, a portrait of Cosimo I's wife. Note the porcelain face, the emotionless aristocratic calm, the extremely elegant dress, and those boneless, elongated hands. The Medicis, as I mentioned, were now Grand Dukes of Tuscany and patrons of Pintormo and Branzino. That, at least, hadn't changed. Christ being removed from the cross and or laid in his tomb was a popular theme in Renaissance and Baroque art. It's a moment that captures Christ's humanity while also carrying with it enormous spiritual power. It's a moment that connects the earthly and heavenly realms. I'm going to shut up now, what a relief, and let you look at 6 different artistic renditions of this famous biblical scene. Ms. Jacobs is going to put you into groups, and each of you will get one of these works to analyze, along with some questions to direct your thinking. Let me just quickly flash them. And we'll end with this weird one.